Dia Dave Galir, Falsa go Féile. Can I welcome everyone here tonight to the Gashard Féile in conversation. I want to personally thank the Féile for asking me for doing this yet again this year, particularly because our guest is someone who people in Derry, indeed people across Ireland and beyond, greatly admire for his outstanding contribution to politics and political activism over many decades. Someone known for providing a voice for those who were not only voiceless, but often silenced. He called out injustice wherever he saw it, and he fought to keep the values of social and economic justice on the political agenda. And his work continues in the Westminster Parliament and through his Peace and Justice Project. Our guest, Jeremy Corbyn, has been a Westminster MP for Islington North since 1983 and a former leader of the Labour Party. So, Jeremy, can I, on behalf of everyone in Derry and the Féile, welcome you and thank you for taking out time and what we know is a very busy schedule to attend this year's Féile.
My absolute pleasure. It's wonderful to be with you, and I'm sorry it's kind of online, but let's do it another time as well, when I can visit Donegal and then do a chat with you in the festival itself. So thanks so much for inviting me. I'm very honoured to be asked.
And it would be a great pleasure. I'm sure the Féile would be more than happy to have you here in the city. If I can begin just by maybe reflecting, and I mentioned that you have a long time involved in political activity. You were formerly a councillor, you worked part of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. I'm just wondering, in terms of your early life, what were your influences, or who were your influences, and what motivated you, and what gave you, obviously, the great values that you possess?
Well, I grew up in a small town in Shropshire in the West Midlands, Newport. I went to the local grammar school there, and I was not particularly successful in school. My mum and dad were both strongly believing socialists and peace people. In fact, they met campaigning in support of the Spanish Republic during the time of the Spanish Civil War. Whilst they didn't sort of push politics down one's throat all the time, was clearly there were a sense of values from them. And my mother particularly was also very keen on giving me books and so on to read, many of which I still have. And indeed, when she died, I inherited all of her Left Book Club collection, which was pretty big, and my dad's as well, of course. And so there was that in the background. My main interests in school were history and geography and the politics of how geographical changes come about. It was also a time of late 50s, early 60s of the growth of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, and the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was something writ large. I took a sort of strong view on, as I still do, on nuclear arms, nuclear weapons, and all these issues. And I found myself in a minority of one or two in most cases in my school class. And so I had to spend a lot of time arguing in defense of my own position. And so those influences were there, but also very strong passion about environmental politics. I was growing up in a beautiful rural area, but it was changing. It was changing. The hedgerows were being grubbed up. The machines were getting bigger. Farm workers were leaving the land, and the nature of the villages and community life was changing very much indeed, not always for the better. And so there was a whole lot of influences at play, and I became more and more involved. And then I joined CND, I joined the Labour Party, I started going on demonstrations and so on from when I was in school. And of course, the Vietnam War was the huge, big debate. It was the massive debate. The argument was that somehow or other going to war in Vietnam was protecting the world from some terrible force. In reality, it was a first world power destroying a very poor people in Vietnam. It was brutal, it was vicious, it was vile, and I was obviously part of the opposition to it. So those are the kind of influences that work on me. Remember, this was pre-internet age, and finding things out meant going to the library to look it up, reading a book about it, asking somebody, or looking in a dictionary to find out what the word meant. Totally different world from today, where you can find almost anything on one of these.
Yeah. And in terms of your early sort of political career, were there people who you looked to as saying that that's the type of person, that's the type of impact I want to make in my community and in Britain and indeed in world politics?
Yes, I began to develop ideas and things. For A-level studies, I did history. I discovered there was a paper called Russia in the Era of Revolution. So I chose that, which meant that the set books were Lenin, Marx, and Engels, which it was a bit difficult for a 16-year-old to understand all of that, but it was quite heavy going, actually. But I was also very interested in the process of Russian history and Russian literature, and I read a lot of Russian novels, as indeed I read a lot of American novels. Were there any particular individuals that influenced me? A growing influence of the more prominent figures in the Labour Party of the time, Michael Foot, Tony Benn, particularly Tony Benn, and internationally, the issues of apartheid in South Africa after the Sharpeville massacre of 1960 was an influence on me, and of course the Rivonia treason trial of 1964, and the names came out: Walter Sisulu, Tambo, Oliver Tambo, and of course Nelson Mandela and many others, and I was influenced by that. And my mother was a very passionate opponent of the apartheid regime, and I recall once mistakenly buying some South African oranges. I was sent to cycle to the nearest town, which was a couple of 3 miles away, to get some stuff from the co-op, and I came back with these South African oranges, and I was sent back to take them back, to say they were never to enter our house till apartheid was over. I mean, it was a mistake on my part, but it was paid for by a long cycle ride in the rain.
A double cycle ride. Over the years, I mean, anybody who have observed, and you certainly hear, many people would have always seen you as a person who stood out because you spoke up for causes, for people who many people would have, maybe walked away from, or it wouldn't have been seen as in inverted commas, the political thing to do. And as a consequence of that, and I mean, the list is many, from Irish people living in Britain, even dealing with issues in Israel in relation to the Palestinian cause, right across Latin America, etc. And even you've talked about nuclear disarmament. But what was very striking about it as well is, the sustained personal attacks that would have been directed towards you. I mean, the word troll wouldn't have been heard of in those days, but certainly if people want to know a history of trolls, then they can look at someone like yourself. How did you manage with that personally? Had you coping mechanisms, or was it this sort of thing? I know what I'm doing is right, so whatever comes with it will come with it.
Well, I'm a pretty calm person most of the time. My formative years on leaving school were to go to Jamaica as a volunteer, and taught there, was a youth leader there, and I began to learn a lot about Caribbean history and the history of the abolitionist movement of the slave trade, which we are taught here is all about the great works of William Wilberforce. And of course, he was a factor in that, an important factor in that, but the real heroes were the leaders of the slave rebellions in Jamaica, the Americas, and many other places, who paid for it with their lives. And so it was understanding how people stood up in a seemingly hopeless situation for the liberty and liberation of others. And I'm always admiring of those. And if I'm in a position to speak up and support people when they're up against it, I will do so. And so I've never forgotten the day that the Guild 4 issue came to my office. Errol Smalley and Theresa Smalley, uncle and aunt of Paul Hill, came to my office and told me about the whole situation and said, "Will you help?" Of course, I did. And we suffered the most unbelievable levels of abuse for supporting the Guildford Four and supporting the Birmingham Six and standing up for Irish people who were held under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. And as I became an MP in 1983, speaking out for them. And that, of course, brought the opprobrium of the Sun and the Mail and the Express and so on, and indeed many of my colleagues in Parliament. So I was quite accustomed to being denigrated. But if you believe in something, stick by it and do it. Yes, I've had a very high level of personal abuse thrown at me. I frankly don't care what's thrown at me. What does upset me is when it's thrown at my sons or thrown at my family or my wife or somebody else, then that's really unpleasant, or my friends. And the last, well, all of my life really has taught me the value and support of comrades and friends that do stand by you. But if you let this sort of stuff get to you and stress you, then they've won. I'm not going to let it get to me.
Yeah, and you certainly have built up a strong resilience over the years in relation to that, because
they call me Monsieur Zen in the office.
Very good. Again, within sort of particularly the Labour Party and indeed in wider sort of political viewpoints, you have always been associated, with that defence of the people who need defended, the Guildford Four, the Birmingham Six. Great belief in the core values of social and economic justice. And I'm just wondering, with those values in mind, what do you believe was the significance, for the Labour movement when you became the leader of the Labour Party?
Well, I was determined that the Labour Party would be true to its roots and be a socialist organisation. And I was determined that we would become a community functioning organisation with community organisers and community development, because the whole strength of all of our movements is the strength of people in their community to get a community centre, to get a school, to get a park, to defend services and extend them. That's how we got the National Health Service. That's how we got free education. That's how we got so many other things. That's how colonies achieved their freedom. That's how slavery was abolished, and so on. So I was determined that we would walk in that tradition. I was also very determined that we'd reset the international agenda. And I said, and did it, that we would apologize for the involvement in the Iraq war, and that we develop an international strategy that was based on peace and justice and human rights and democracy. And it wouldn't be based on the ability to go to war or threaten other countries. And looking back on it, those are the areas that caused me the most problems and the most attack and abuse. But I'll tell you, there's turning points in these things. During the 2017 election, the Manchester bomb took place. It was appalling. It was abominable. There was no way you could possibly defend it. And campaigning was suspended for a few days. And then the day it was reinstated, I decided to make a speech saying this is a reflection of our foreign policy. And if we get involved in wars like Afghanistan, Iraq, or the bombing of Syria, or the bombing of Libya, it's not going to end well. It's going to, as I said in my speech in 2003, create the wars, the refugee flows, and the terrorists of tomorrow. And many people advised me not to make that speech. I made that speech. I was condemned for it within seconds by the Daily Mail, etc. And then an opinion poll was done, a phone poll was done, and that came out about 4 hours later, which showed that almost 60% of the population said I was right. And to me, that showed that all that campaigning against wars, all that campaigning against the excesses of anti-terror legislation, all the rest of it had got through. And so it shows to me that when you're being denigrated, your message can get through.
And you have always had that sense, that despite sometimes how the media might portray your message, you always had a belief that maybe people out there were responding to it because there was that sense of themselves, of justice and fairness.
Yeah. Somewhere along the line, people will understand it and will pick it up. And I think it is a question of resilience in campaigning. But if you start from the assumption that you're a minority, nobody likes you, nobody wants to support you, and everybody's going to oppose you. Well, it's a pretty bad mindset to begin a campaign to bring about a socialist world. Yeah. So I believe in a socialist world and the socialist values that go with it, which are that you treat everybody equally, you treat everyone with respect, you reduce levels of inequality, and you ensure that nobody's left behind. And I tell you what, some of the wisest people are not necessarily those occupying exotic chairs in universities. They're sometimes caring for our elderly. They're sometimes people that are sweeping our streets. They're sometimes even people that are homeless. They are often very philosophical and very interesting to talk to. So surely we should approach the world on the basis everyone we meet knows something we don't know.
Absolutely. In your last comments, you mentioned the 2017 election, which is very interesting indeed, because we're busy here in Ireland, fighting our own campaigns. You sort of missed a part of that campaign, but it was in reflection afterwards. And looking back, to me, it was an opportunity lost. There should have been a Labour government that should have won the election. I just wondered, was there people there who spurned that opportunity, who didn't believe, or was there a sort of sense that it was nearly because you were the leader, they didn't believe that you could rally people in the way that you did?
Well, I took it that I was taking the hit for everybody else, and that's okay. We won the leadership in 2015. We were challenged in 2016 and won again. And Theresa May thought that by calling a snap election in June 2017, somehow or other, she'd give herself a huge majority. And the day the election was called, Labour was on 24% in the opinion polls. The Conservatives were on something well over 45% or so. And lots of media said to me, well, this is hopeless. What are you going to do? I said, we're going to go out there and fight. We're going to go out there and campaign. We're going to go out there and offer an alternative. And we did. For the many, not the few, was a real alternative. It was a wonderful manifesto. I'm very proud of it because it opened the eyes of people. Redistribution of power and wealth, environmental sustainability, human rights and justice, national education system, all those issues, and of course the international agenda that went with it. And we just took it out there and we went on the road with it. I spent the whole of the campaign traveling the length and breadth of the country. I did more than 100 events, and we ended up with almost 41% of the vote, and we came within a whisker of becoming a government at that time. I later found out the degree of malevolence of the media towards me and the degree of people apparently in my own party who didn't want us to win the election. I'm awaiting the Ford Report's publication whenever it comes out. But I tell you this, I'm proud of what we achieved. I'm proud of the manifestos we put forward. And I'd do it all again, because the way to defeat the nastiness, the meanness and the malevolence of a Tory government is not agreeing with them, it's challenging them, and challenging them with popular support, and above all, giving particularly our young people real hope and real opportunity. Why should they be blamed for everything? Why should they be impoverished? Why should they be fined for going to university and wanting to achieve the best in their lives? And so it is about raising the sights of people. But we're talking of the joy of festivals and music. One part I'm really proud of is that we included in our manifestos a special fund for music, art, education for all our kids in all our schools. There's a poet in every child. Let the poet speak.
Absolutely. And you mentioned there that you took part in 100 events over the short campaign. Had you a sense when you were campaigning that you were making an impact, that sort of low opinion poll was not the true reflection?
Absolutely. Yeah. Every time I went out from our offices and went to rallies or events all over the country, and the numbers got bigger and bigger and bigger, they're absolutely enormous rallies. And I was saying to those that were studying the entrails of opinion polls, which were asking questions almost of self-justification, I said, look, you're out of touch. Out there's people rushing to the cause. There's people joining in. There's people doing it with excitement. go outside and listen, go outside and learn, listen to what people are saying. And politics became the point of discussion. And we were absolutely growing in support very, very rapidly. And I meet people all over the country, because I travel a lot now, who say how inspired they were by that campaign, and indeed the later campaigns that we ran. And they're not walking away from politics, they're active in politics. Hence this project we've set up here, which is about mobilizing people in making demands on a society. Nobody should be homeless. Nobody should be poor. No kid should be without hope. And no older person should be fearful of trying to survive in poverty in their old age. You can't achieve any of those changes unless you challenge the inequality of wealth and power in our society. And that's exactly what we're doing. And that's why the establishment hated us so much.
Good. This year, just want to move you on now, maybe to sort of your view in terms of Ireland and maybe even partition in general, not just in Ireland, but this year's the 100th anniversary of partition of Ireland. The backdrop to it, strangely, is a very invigorated discussion, led by, political people, but people in civic society, people in sport and cultural organisations, a vision of a new Ireland which can emerge. And I'm just wondering, have you been following this, and how do you see it?
Of course, I do follow the debate and follow it very closely indeed, because I'm fascinated by Irish history, fascinated by the brutality of the treatment of the Irish people, going back to the English occupation, going back to Cromwell and what he did at the end of the English Civil War, when he tried to march those that had fought against the English crown in order to establish a colony in Ireland. So he was practicing his own imperialism in what he did. And of course, the horrors of the famine, the Great Hunger, which was later analysed for what it really is. It was an act of horror against the Irish people, and Ireland, at the same time as many people were being starved to death, was actually exporting food at the same time. And one of the best museums I've seen on that is in Skibbereen, fantastic museum of the famine, pointing out the truths about it. And so these histories have to be learnt and learnt over and over again. And it's that understanding of Irish history and Irish culture that to me is so important, and the island of Ireland as a whole. And in a way, the issues about debates over Brexit, etc., have meant that the island of Ireland as a whole has become a stronger self-looking economic entity than it was before. And I think that's quite significant and quite important. And I welcome development of the Irish language. I welcome development of teaching of Irish history and Irish understanding, and also the principles behind the Good Friday Agreement, which were an understanding of the cultures of all communities in Ireland, particularly the two main communities in Northern Ireland. And it's that shared history that is so important. And I've always found those discussions in the West Belfast Festival and other places absolutely fascinating. And indeed, I did a very long Q&A with students in Lagan College a couple of years ago, and I learned a lot from that conversation.
In relation to partition and its impact, or just where?
In relation to the impact of partition, yes. In relation to the study in history and the way in which communities were separated by partition and deliberately separated by partition, and the work that particularly Martin McGuinness did as education minister in Northern Ireland to try and bring about comprehensive education and an end to selective education. I think that's a very important step forward.
Yeah, and in terms now of the debate, do you think the experience of partition in our countries should lead people to a sort of place where they're saying now perhaps is the time to examine partition?
You have to look, yes, indeed, it is a time to examine partition, and the 100th anniversary of it is a great time to do that and understand the historical process that led to it and understand the political opportunism that encouraged it at that time and the price of it. And you look at the price of partition in the case of India and Pakistan in 1947. If you look at the price of partition in the island of New Guinea, you look at partition of Cyprus, and there are many other examples around the world. And I have to say, what's been instructive to me is that the peace process that came about from the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland has become something that people have used elsewhere. The way in which in Colombia, the negotiations that went on were in part inspired by the experience in Ireland, in the talks that went on in Havana, and many other places around the world. And so, yeah, I think it's a time to ask people to reflect on this, to think about this and look at that historical process. Are there going to be arguments? Sure. Of course there's going to be arguments. Of course there's going to be debates. But if you approach it from a basis that you're not trying to put anyone in fear of the future and in fear of change, instead you're trying to recognize where they're coming from, then I think we make for a stronger society.
Okay. In relation to just talking about the future, I mean, obviously you have now have obviously dedicated all of your adult life to the political activism, representative politics, representing your constituency as long as you have. Have you any sort of sense where you would like to be in 10 years' time, and in particular, you know, the work now of your project, the Peace and Justice Project?
I am always politically active and always will be politically active. And I love representing Islington North. I know the area very, very well. Obviously, I've represented it for almost 40 years. And I want to continue that work of representing people on issues of housing, of health, of social justice and of immigration and of refugee status. And I want to be part of this campaign to stand up for the rights of refugees. Refugees at the moment are the ones being denigrated as being the great threat to us. Why are there so many refugees in the world? 80 million of them. Because of wars, because of environmental disaster, because of economic inequality, because of greed of global corporations. And they're being told, we're being told they are the threat. We're being told that it's all the problem of people traffickers. People traffickers only exist because a market has been created for them by the abuse of people that are trying to survive in the world. So I want to work on human rights and justice issues globally, which is what we're doing in the project. But our project has chosen 4 areas of work. I'll be very quick, but briefly. 1, challenging the power of the media, challenging the control and ownership of the media. So we're setting up news clubs all around the country. News clubs where people come together to challenge possibly what their local media is doing, but be a creative growth in an alternative media where we share each other's platforms, share each other's information. Challenge Rupert Murdoch's ownership, but also recognize that social media isn't the free space we all think it is. It's full of algorithms that drive us in certain directions. It's full of controls. And when it suits the owners of it, they'll shut it down, as they did for the Indian farmers. Secondly, campaigning on economic justice, supporting the Right to Food campaign, supporting campaigns for trade union recognition, supporting campaigns against fire and rehire, where whole workforces are dismissed and replaced by the same people on worse wages and worse conditions. So we're totally involved in that, and obviously campaigns in support of public ownership. Thirdly, environmental justice. We have COP26 coming up. We've got to get to net zero emissions as quickly as possible. We have to improve our biodiversity. We have to recognize we cannot go on destroying this planet at the rate we are. And so that means actually reflecting on the economic way in which we live. I think the arguments about the right of everyone to a basic standard of living have come full circle, and their argument whose time has come. And so I've been involved in regional environmental roundtable discussions, and I'll certainly be there in Glasgow during COP26, linking up with people from all over the world. And the last areas of international justice and solidarity. And we held a very big conference on the arms trade very recently, a huge conference in which we had people from Canada, from the USA, from Yemen, people from Egypt and many other parts of the world, explaining how the high tech and brilliance of the weapon systems has made life so intolerable and so impossible for the poorest people in Yemen. And so it is about international solidarity for peace and justice. And I'm very proud of the work we've done. We've never done enough. We've never gone far enough. We've never gone fast enough. And it's that my irritating determination to do more quickly. And that will never leave me.
Very good. And I think that's a good way to think that do more and do it quickly in many ways, because when people look at your career and look at you as a person, as an activist, then I think most people will be saying, you know, that's what we all should be aspiring towards, that sort of sense of justice and fair play. So on behalf of myself, I think this is a personal privilege that I've been asked to interview you today. And on behalf of Féile, can I thank you again for your wonderful insight, and particularly for taking time out of what is a very busy schedule to share with us your thoughts and views. So on behalf of us all,
thank you very much indeed. My absolute pleasure. Next time in Derry.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thanks.